This is Chapter 9, Section 3, Life in the Great Depression. Farmers on the Great Plains were amongst the worst suffering Americans during the Great Depression. Already in the 1920s, farmers weren't doing great because the prices have plummeted so low since so many people didn't need as much crops and food because we were no longer in the war in Europe, so we weren't shipping goods to them anymore. So farmers' prices really dropped because they were used to overproducing. And then furthermore, once the Great Depression hit, it got worse. New Deal programs by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president at the time, did little to help these farmers. There wasn't much legislation that really dealt with helping out the farmers. Not only did these farmers on the Great Plains struggle, but they also were a victim of a natural disaster that lasted 7 years. Part of what contributed to this natural disaster was the farmers' farming practices that removed the native grasses that held the dry Great Plains soil in place. That led to soil erosion. So in order to plant their fields, they would plow up all the kind of scrub grasses that held all the Great Plains soil in place, and that would then kind of get them in the end, because when the rain that usually would dampen the soil enough to keep it from blowing away stopped, in a severe drought in the 1930s, then all the soil plus high winds that would happen often on the Great Plains created these dust storms. So the continuous dust storms on the Great Plains lasted from 1933 to 1940, and the area of the Great Plains itself became known as the Dust Bowl. Some of these storms were so bad, as you can see in the photo here, it would pretty much block out the sun, and were known as black blizzards. The dust storms would force people to wear these dust masks. You really couldn't go outside unless you wore one because you'd choke on the dust. You're pretty much eating it. And then sometimes storms would kill people, either from inhaling so much dust, or if you're driving or something like that and you can't see. And then sometimes people would get buried when the dust settled. With rain being not happening very much, and the constant dust storms, their crops just died, and they weren't able to feed themselves, let alone sell their crops at the market. So here's kind of the Dust Bowl states. Pretty much happened right in the middle of the United States. As you can see, some areas were worse than others, kind of like part of Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and Colorado. That was the worst. And then a lot of areas around it were also hit hard. You can see some of the early dust masks, just so they can go outside. So that's a dust storm going into a town, rolling in, and then that's kind of the after effects. See how we just bury stuff? The dust, whenever it just settles, that's where it settles and buries things. Farmers began to lose hope after year not being able to grow crops, and they began to leave the Great Plains, and they would pack up all their stuff and leave the farm. Where they would go was California, because California, it's a big state, and it's not just Los Angeles and beaches. There's actually really rich farmland there in California, and all these Great Plain farmers left to go there. But when they went there, these California residents did not appreciate these migrant farmers. They actually called them Okies, because a lot had come from Oklahoma. And Okies wasn't really a great term. It was kind of derogative, and they didn't really like it too much, but they kind of owned it because they were coming into another state and just hoping for work or farmland. But unfortunately, these Okies, they just found more hardship in California. They were unable to buy land. They didn't have that much money. A lot of it wasn't even for sale. And a lot of these farmers were forced to just compete for these labor jobs because someone came over. So they would live in these like little shanty towns, almost like Hoovervilles, around these farms. just looking for work. Eventually, California would shut down their roads to stop like the massive influx of migrant workers. And I'll show you here. That's one of these signs right here. No jobs in California. Keep out. You know, there's no work in California. Stop coming in. So it's pretty easy to spot these Okies coming in because they'd have everything piled up on their car, everything on. You got the armchairs and everything like that. You know, anything they got the dining room table there, anything they could have to travel with. So, but there, like when there was work, like we need orange pickers. Okay, everybody was racing just to do that. So there was a lot of literature written about the Dust Bowl in the Great Plains and the migration to California. John Steinbeck wrote 2 such books. One was called The Grapes of Wrath, depicting the struggle of an Okie family to survive the Dust Bowl and then their move out to California to search for a better life. This was written in 1939. Then in 1940, a movie was made called The Grapes of Wrath that was based on the book, and it showed visually the description of these hard times of these Okies moving to California. And then in 1937, Steinbeck also wrote another novel called Of Mice and Men. A lot of high schools require this as a book to read. Some of you might have read it. It's about 2 displaced migrant ranchers looking for work in California, and they move from place to place in California and search for new job opportunities. They finally have a job opportunity on this one farm, and they kind of goes from there, and they kind of have their own adventure there, and their struggle to find work and struggle to find a place in the world that that's really hard to find a job, and just trying to carve out your little piece of paradise. So life in the Great Depression for women, while most of their husbands were out of work, it forced them to look for ways to provide for the family as well. They couldn't just stay home because their husbands weren't making enough money to support the family. They needed to join the workforce as well. And actually, by the end of the Great Depression, more women had jobs than by the start. Unfortunately, it was also hard for women to find work. Jobs previously held by women were now held by men looking for work, such as teaching. So it was mostly women teachers, but as soon as like a man, he lost his job from maybe the factories or something like that, they would find maybe work like, okay, we'll teach. Jobs like that. Women would also be the first to be let go from their factory jobs. They would be among the first. Even though it was kind of weird to say, okay, who to fire first, back then, you know, they would fire women first and hope for a man to have a job. And really, the thinking behind that was, yeah, a man needs to provide for his family. We're gonna try to keep them on. Many maids, seamstresses, housekeeping jobs that women had were lost because the rich people, they could no longer afford such services. Women did try valiantly to hold families together. They were the real MVP, as you could say. They saved every penny when they could. They worked when they could. They made sewed clothing. They made it work. Canned food, and just like spreading the food that they have, they made it spread as thinly as they could. So here's they are in a factory in 1930s, getting back to work. You can see some of the women are pretty young. You know, just the women making the meals, trying to do secretarial work, anything they could to keep them going. Probably the most famous woman during this time period was Eleanor Roosevelt. She's the wife of the President Franklin Roosevelt, and during this time during the Depression, she was the First Lady of the United States. And before Eleanor Roosevelt, First Ladies kind of stayed in the background, didn't mess around with political matters, kind of just hosted teas and dinners, and was kind of just a dignified woman. But Eleanor Roosevelt, she redefined this position. She took on an active role, and she wanted to be involved in the political politics and helping the nation firsthand. Part of what allowed her to do this was that President Roosevelt, since his legs were paralyzed, it was harder for him to travel around the country. So Eleanor did the traveling for Franklin Roosevelt, and she would report back to her husband on how Americans were faring during the Great Depression. Eleanor once traveled 40,000 miles in 1 year across the United States, visiting all kind of different Americans all around the U.S. One time she even took a trip down a mining shaft in West Virginia, something that a First Lady would never think about doing previously to Eleanor Roosevelt. While First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt made speeches, she talked to newspapers. She wrote a column in the newspaper 6 out of 7 days out of the week. She was a busy lady. Eleanor was a champion for women's rights. She actually had an all-women reporters do her press conferences. She encouraged Franklin Roosevelt to appoint more females to government and leadership positions. She was really a leading example of how all modern First Ladies would behave. All First Ladies since Eleanor Roosevelt have taken more of an active role. Usually they do something, they kind of pick something that they want to tackle on, kind of like Michelle Obama. She was about children's health and just getting Americans to live healthier lives with what they ate and exercise. But now First Ladies are really involved, and they go across the country and meet people, and just a part of the American political scene. That you can see here, Eleanor going to the mining shaft, talking to kids, see what's going on, and she, like I said, she would write this article 6 out of 7 days out of the week. In one of her quotes, you can often change your circumstances by changing your attitude. I like that quote. That's a good one. And that's her all-female press reporters. Minority Americans also had it pretty tough during the Great Depression, particularly the African American community. In the South, low cotton prices caused African American sharecroppers, meaning that they kind of paid off their land. It kind of like leased the land. The land was leased to them, and they had to pay it off with their crops. But if there was no crops, they could not afford to keep that land. So more than half of African Americans in the South were jobless. They moved north to cities for work, but many of them traditionally went to those jobs in the northern cities that went to African Americans, such as cleaning the streets, went to unemployed white people. So unfortunately, just because of racist tendencies in the time, white people will get the jobs before African Americans in cities. In factory work, African Americans were usually, the phrase was, last hired and first fired during the Great Depression. So it was, even though it was hard for everybody to find work, it was especially hard for African Americans to find and keep work. In New York City, 50% of African Americans were unemployed during the Great Depression. Mexican Americans also were faced with pretty hard times during the Great Depression. They were forced out of their labor jobs because unemployed whites needed those labor jobs. Their white-collar jobs, business owners and things like that just weren't around anymore. So they were so a lot of white Americans, they needed those simple labor jobs that were needed, and they forced out the Mexican Americans. Some Mexican Americans that were forced out were actually American citizens. They were born in the United States, but they were forced out anyways to reserve jobs for white Americans. That's unheard of. I mean, if you're an American citizen, you have a right to be in the United States, but they would force them back to Mexico anyways. The U.S. government would round up Mexican Americans all over the country, deport them back to Mexico. It split up families, communities all over the United States. This was one of the real tragedies of the Great Depression, sending Americans to a country that they weren't even born in, all because they were of that ancestry. Art of the Great Depression was big. Artists and photographers used the Great Depression as their focus of their art. Dorothea Lange photographed the experience of the migrant farmers of the Dust Bowl, and her famous photograph, The Migrant Mother, became a symbol of the Great Depression. Here it is right here, the picture of the Migrant Mother. It's a very famous photo. Little insight about it. You know, when you're getting your picture taken, I mean, it wasn't instant back then. They tried to do candid photos. But these two children, why they're doing that is because they kept laughing in front of the camera. So that's why they're kind of hiding their faces, because they couldn't stop laughing. Most of the movies during the Great Depression aimed at entertaining Americans with adventurous films that will allow them to escape their problems for a while. King Kong was released to wide popularity because it's a thrilling tale of this giant gorilla loose in New York. So if that wouldn't get your mind off things, not sure what will. Actually, there's even a new King Kong movie coming out soon. King Kong versus Godzilla. So King Kong's popularity is still going strong. Also, Disney had its first full-length feature film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. That was released in 1937. Media was still going on during the Great Depression as much as it could. Shirley Temple was a famous child movie star. She was known for her lightheartedness and funny movies, and to spread some kind of optimism and hope during dark times in the United States. So here's, Snow White, the original Disney princess here. Shirley Temple, she was just a redheaded little child star there, very popular. And you have King Kong. Honestly, for 1933, pretty good movie. If you can get past kind of the cheesiness of the kind of the visuals here, but pretty good movie. Alright, also in the 1930s, some of the New Deal things that President Roosevelt did was the Social Security Act. That has lasted even to current times. Major part of the Social Security was that that's still read today is providing for Americans of retired age. So you don't have to work until you literally die. You have some kind of pension, which is a retirement plan, that pays you every month when you retire. It's nice, but you have to pay into it. That's the thing. Employers and employees pay into it for an employee, and when you retire, you can receive monthly payments. If you don't have a job that pays into Social Security, you're not going to receive Social Security. So if you're a business owner that doesn't pay into Social Security for yourself, you're not going to receive any. Part of what Social Security also aids with is people with disabilities that can't work anymore or have mental disabilities that don't allow them to work. Helps mother take care of their children. Helps laid off workers. So Social Security that started in the Great Depression is still around today. And then critics of the New Deal. The New Deal did create a lot of programs of helping Americans out, but a lot of critics don't approve of how large the federal government really became, and really hasn't shrunk down since the New Deal program started. Government wasn't so involved in Americans' lives, directly involved. After the New Deal, that's just kind of life in the United States. Federal government has just so many programs that are involved in Americans' lives. Another critic is that the government just spent so much money trying to get the country out of the Great Depression, and President Roosevelt, with his programs, he used a tactic called deficit spending. He was spending more money than the government was taking in to pay for all these programs, which you always hear in political debates, trying to balance that budget. We don't want the United States going into debt, but that's what kind of the New Deal program was. The United States was spending more money than it had. Like I said, the New Deal, it did help a lot of Americans get jobs, but it really didn't stop the Depression. It wasn't until 1941 when the United States was making a lot of money producing war goods for World War II that it officially got out of the Great Depression. So if it wasn't for World War II, we're not sure how long the Depression would last and whether the New Deal programs would have actually brought an end to the Depression. But despite all this, many Americans were very thankful for the New Deal programs that saved them from poverty. It gave them a purpose. It gave them jobs again. Just employed many of Americans. It did end the banking crisis and reformed the stock market. No, the stock market really hasn't done that since. It hasn't officially crashed ever since new legislation went. It's definitely gone down before, but it's never crashed like in 1929. New Deal programs, we have a lot of stuff to be thankful for. A lot of buildings, dams, bridges, national parks were created because of the New Deal programs that are still around today. And at the very least, Americans began to believe in their government again, and show the government that would be there for them when times of need. So at least the New Deal did that.